So stand by.
Mhm.
So we are live. Guten Morgen. Good morning, everyone. And welcome to the second day of the PPM Summit. And today we start with a very exciting presentation on joint development generic projects between two companies. How? And this was a topic we were partly touching upon yesterday as well. And there were a few interesting questions on this. And it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker, Michal Urban, who is project management and launch preparation lead at Sanofi. He is located in the nice location of Prague in the Czech Republic. And it's pretty sunny over there, as you can see already. And Michal has an outstanding background, education-wise as well as experience-wise, and he is an experienced global project manager responsible for leading international and cross-functional global project teams for generics as well as innovative Sanofi projects with robust clinical development program from phase 1 to phase 3. He was also responsible for supervision of global launches of generics and innovative products of Sanofi in General Medicine Global Business Unit, covering business activities in mature markets, Africa, Asia, Eurasia, Middle East, and Latin America. So it's my pleasure to introduce Michal and invite him to start his presentation. Over to you.
So thank you very much, Samir, for this nice introduction. Thanks a lot. And good morning to everyone, to all the participants of this nice and interesting event. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much, organizers, for inviting me to this event. I will share a screen. Let's get right to the presentation because I know that our time is limited. So just a second. So can you see my screen well?
Yeah, absolutely clear. Go ahead, Michal.
Okay, perfect. So let's get right to the agenda for my today's presentation. So Samir was kind enough to present me, to introduce me at the very beginning. So I will be quick in the first part. What I will present you today is a case study on a joint development generic project, which I was leading. I think it will be maybe more for project managers, this perspective that I will bring, but I hope it will be also interesting and a nice presentation for our colleagues in portfolio, business development, in licensing, or even the regulatory colleagues who participate in our today's session. So I will draw some points that we had to align on with the third party on this joint development project to attention, specifically on API sourcing and clinical development strategy. I could talk on and on, but we have limited time, so I will just present or showcase just a few examples. And I think we can manage it in 20 minutes so that we can have still time for Q&A for your questions at the end. Okay, so from my side, so most of that has already been said. So I work as a global project manager in Sanofi, which is an innovative company indeed, but we still do maintain generic business in some dedicated, let's say, set of territories outside of Europe, even after divestment of Zentiva. So even the case study, which I'm about to present you, will be based on my experience on the project for emerging countries. I must say that I'm fortunate enough in our company to be in charge of various type of projects, which I like. So I'm not only in charge of generic projects, but also API, biosimilar programs, or lifecycle management projects for the key Sanofi brands, which include also phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and also medical device. Recently, we were actually transitioning from commercial operations to medical structures. So now we are in charge of some, let's say, indication expansions projects using real-world evidence data and ISS studies. So it's quite diverse, and this is what I like. So this is what I do in Sanofi. And in terms of my background, so I'm a doctor of pharmacy and PhD in biomedicine, and I'm also project management professional, so this PMP. So let's get right to the case study itself. So at the very beginning, just a disclosure. So due to confidentiality reasons, of course, I had to, let's say, adjust some of the dates, or let's say, modify some of the information, but it will not prevent the basic understanding of the subject. Okay, so it will illustrate the situation that we are facing in this joint development project. So basic information. So we at Sanofi and a third party, let's call it company B, we had the intention to launch a generic product in a different territories which were defined in this joint development contract. As you can imagine, as always, the IP limits for market entry were different from one country to another. And the company B intended to launch in Europe, whereas us, Sanofi, we plan to launch in Brazil, Colombia, Russia, Turkey, and South Africa. And what is important to emphasize is that we as Sanofi were planning to launch first, based on the IP situation. The development center belonged to a company B, okay? And the list of development activities were defined either as a joint, which means that they were common or in interest for both parties, or as customization, where company B basically supported us. Let's imagine it was a Brazilian customization project. In this case, company B provided some expertise or delivered some development work only for us, but it had nothing to do with European launches, yeah, with the launches in Europe. So joint and customization activities, it is important to know this distinction. I will talk about it later on. And there were two project managers. So one was so-called pilot, that was on the company B side. Myself, I was a co-pilot acting on behalf of Sanofi. There was a typical, let's say, PM structure with the project steering committee to discuss all the updates in the roadmaps, deviations from the plan and budget. If we had to escalate something, there was this committee where basically representatives from both sides were there. So it worked pretty well. And we have defined at the beginning the common milestones. In this case, it was API drug master file, pilot and pivotal bioequivalent study, and dossier ready. And now I will present you a couple of examples where we sort of had to reach some compromise, or we had to come to terms with a third party on several subjects. One of them would be API sourcing. So first example. So the development center, basically they developed the API manufacturing process in-house, and that was then transferred to a CMO. However, then later on, the company B decided they don't want to pursue the cooperation with the CMO because they had a bad experience in the past. They didn't deliver as they expected. So the decision from the management was that they will cease the cooperation with this CMO. However, at that time, this CMO has already produced a certain amount of API under GMP conditions, which would actually cover the need for the production of the clinical batches for pilot B study. Yeah. In addition, what I will mention is that the qualified person in the CMO stated that after transfer, they realized that the process was not robust enough for the scaling up for the commercialization. So they proposed some further optimization of the process if they would continue. And lastly, company B, they proposed to me as a project manager on Sanofi that they would use the source from the CMO for the pilot B study clinical batches so that we don't delay the initiation of those studies. Okay. And we as Sanofi had basically three options. The first option was to accept the API sourcing for the clinical batches so that we don't face any delay in the studies. First option. Sounds clear. The second option was to conduct the pilot B study with the old source of API and then switch to another one for a pivotal B study. That was actually another backup solution from the company B side they proposed. Or the third option was that we would request the company B to find alternative API source for both pilot and pivotal B study. And now let's break it down. So what we had to do, or what I had to do as a project manager, is to first look at the global project plan, right? So their proposal to accept the API sourcing in order not to face the delay, we look at the global project plan and so this is again just for illustration. You don't need to pay attention to the details. I will show you. So the pivotal B study was planned, let's say, somewhere at the beginning of Q4 2020. What we did is that we were planning to transfer the technology from the development center to our Sanofi manufacturing site, finished product manufacturing site, which was located in Turkey, where we plan to produce registration batches, which will be done with the 6-month stability data submitted to the health authorities. Okay, and that was planned in Q3 2021. And you can see what is on the critical path in most of the time is dossier ready, right? As soon as you submit the dossier, if there is some data exclusivity, you need to respect it, of course, but the sooner you submit the dossier, the sooner you have the marketing authorization, the sooner you launch. So this is what is on the critical path, for sure. What is being done in parallel, which is important, is that they were still, let's say, validating the second API source for the product, and that was, let's say, planned to have it done all in Q1 21. So, and for us in Sanofi, it was important to have the second API source because no one wants to go even for the registration with monosourcing. We wanted to have a backup. So if you would see just on the timeline here, you see that the pivotal B study was not actually on the critical path, and we still had minimum couple of months, if not quarters, to potentially put it off if needed. But what was more important is to really speed up and ensure that we have implemented second API source even before we produce these batches in our manufacturing site. So as a result, it turned out, that the clinical study itself was not on the critical path. So the delay in the initiation, of the study was acceptable. It was not major thing. What was more critical on the other side was to ensure that we have 2 API sources for the production of GMP batches. In addition to that, if you think of it, if you remember my note previously, the qualified person said that the process, API manufacturing process was not robust enough. So actually, if we would run in using the same API source for the clinical study as well as then for future, let's say, GMP batches, we could potentially also face some risk of out of specification results, because after the optimization of the process, there could be some major issues, in the stability. So we didn't want to risk that. So for us, this first option to accept their sourcing was not acceptable. The second option, to conduct pilot B study with the old source and then switch to another source for pivotal B study. Meanwhile, the company B would have time to, let's say, find another external source, for instance. That was also not acceptable for us. And why? Because there was a risk that there would be a different behavior of the product in vivo if you switch from one source to another. Because, despite all the evidence, all the API solubility and stability data, formulation similarity studies, or comparative dissolution profiles, you still have a risk that you cannot fully extrapolate the in vitro results to in vivo, especially in specific BCS class type of drugs. So we didn't want to voluntarily risk that. So we said that this is not the way moving forward either. The third option is the right one, and that was that we requested the company B to find alternative API source both for pilot and pivotal B study, because as we learned, we were willing to accept the possible delay of the clinical studies. We didn't mind because we had enough time in our timeline. And on top of that, what I will mention here, what you may know, for Brazil and Colombia, you typically for the submission need to submit a fresh certificate of analysis from the drug product on 3 batches. Yeah, and you need to basically submit these COAs using all API sources which you declare in the dossier at the time of submission. And what would happen is that actually we would use old API source in the pivotal B study, which is of course already presented in the dossier. And then later on, since company B would discontinue the cooperation with the CMO, they will not be viable source 5 years later on. We will not be able to produce those batches. So we will have an issue, and we would maybe even need to repeat the B study. So that was not acceptable for us. You could maybe question, we could have also had a separate deal with the CMO if you wanted to, but then you have basically not the volumes of the company B, you have higher COGS, this could impact the business case. Basically, it's a complication that we didn't want to do. So that was another reason why we insisted on that. And basically we come to terms with the third party. They accepted it, and we didn't face any delay in our project timeline. So both parties were satisfied, I would say. Another quick example on the API sourcing. So as you can imagine, I said at the beginning, Sanofi was intending to launch earlier, let's say in 2025, whereas company B many years later on in 2030. So of course, if you imagine yourself in their shoes, you would also prefer to postpone all major development investment to a later stage. Why would you actually do it too early if you don't have to? And another point which is important to emphasize is that they were a so-called driver of the project, which was based on some commercial assumptions. I will not go into details, but basically it meant that they would cover 2/3 of all development costs for all joint development costs. So imagine you don't need to do it right now, and you even have to pay 2/3 of the costs, which you can postpone to a later stage. So of course they will not, let's say, happy with this situation, and they proposed to us first that the external API source, the second API, they plan to implement it later on in the project, because at that time the price of API was pretty high. They expected drop in the future, and they were not in a hurry at all. However, we as Sanofi, we had to insist to implement the second API source as soon as possible, because, especially before conducting the tech transfer, because we wanted to have the batches produced with both APIs and present those in the first submission. So what was important is that we have this statement, of course, in the joint development contract, that the development center belonging to company B, as I said, was obligated to deliver the API sourcing flow and 2 suppliers per each API. That was basically their mandatory task. And this sourcing flow had to be validated by both parties, including us. So we said, no, guys, we really want to have 2 suppliers and we need it now. So we basically were able to refer to this contract clause. So as a result, the company B, they found eventually external API source. They expedite also the internal, API process development and transfer to CMO. Everything was done timely, in a timely manner. But sometimes in life you need to do some compromises. So what we accepted eventually is, based on our mutual agreement, is that the API costs, which were linked with the transfer to a CMO, they had to produce some batches of API. They were fully covered for 100% by Sanofi, because the material. We benefited from the production of this material, because we use it then later on for our GMP batches at the future manufacturing site. So it was some kind of a compromise. It wasn't a big thing. It wasn't too costly. And at the end, we somehow were able to go with this strategy. So that was like a second example of the API sourcing part. I will now move to a clinical development strategy. Where we had to align together. So as I mentioned earlier, the company B, they want to postpone all major development investment, right? And definitely for generic projects, B study is a major investment. In our case, it was around 600K, because they had enough time for launch. In 5 years' time, you can have the B study or B guideline change. So it was, again, a logical move from their side. And the joint development activity itself, and also its associated compensation, has been defined in the contract as a drug development activity, which is in interest of both parties in the framework of a joint project. Yeah. So both parties need to benefit from this joint activity, like pivotal B study. And of course, the pivotal B study, so that it can be of use for both parties, had to be carried out in Europe and use European reference products to comply with the legislation. And what the company B came up with as a proposal is that, should the clinical data from this pivotal B study in Europe not be of any use for our Sanofi territories, they suggested that we as Sanofi would conduct only the local bioequivalence studies on our own, where applicable, and that the B study in Europe as such would be excluded from the joint development program. That was a little bit tricky, because if this is actually conducted on a joint basis, then, as I mentioned, it also has impact on who covers the budget. So it was co-funding between Sanofi and company B. So they suggested to exclude it if we don't need it. So what we had to investigate is that, for each territory to see what the requirements are. And we had a good idea, I would say, from previous examples, but still worth to check. So for Russia and Brazil, the local B study is typically required. Yeah, so it was considered as this customization project, meaning that we did get some limited support, expert support from a company B. But otherwise, it was solely up to Sanofi to conduct the study itself through our CSU units. What I will mention here, maybe for your information only, you may be aware, but in Russia, starting from end of 2020, there is this EA-EU procedure in place, so which is an analogical procedure to European DCP, decentralized procedure, and they issued the law that if the study itself was conducted prior to 2016, then the B study results on European reference samples could be acceptable, and we actually leveraged it in one project. However, from then onwards, depending on the type of procedure was not critical here, but the rule that you need to conduct local bioequivalence study was there. However, with the one statement, which also for us was a little bit vague, is that you can still apply to submit a study with European study results, but then a GCP inspection of the CRO may be requested by the Russian Ministry of Health, which is a little bit tricky. We didn't really feel very certain about this. So, I mean, we did conduct local bioequivalence studies for all cases, just to avoid this risk. So that was for Russia and Brazil. So we had to conduct local bioequivalence study. We didn't need European study results. For Turkey, we liaised with the local Turkish authority on an informal basis, rather, I would say, via email, and asked them if we need to have a Turkish reference product for the study, or if we can use European samples, because there was also some change in the legislation implying that we would later on need to conduct even local study in Turkey. So we wanted to know their feedback, and they said that it is acceptable as long as we provide a justification, which is also a little bit tricky statement. What is the justification? It's definitely not scientific. You just don't want to produce a separate study just for Turkey if you don't think it's necessary. So it's more of a commercial justification, but maybe you would just submit comparative dissolution profiles, see that it is the same product, same behavior, etc. So since we had the experience on other project that we succeeded with the justification and we could use European study data, we found it quite certain that we could use the pivotal B study from Europe also for Turkey. And for Colombia, the law is that the local bioequivalence study is not necessary, provided that you will do a tech transfer for local manufacturing. What was even more important for us actually at this stage is that you don't even need a European CPP. You don't need a CPP from country of origin. So as a result, based on these two aspects for Turkey and Colombia, we were able to affirm that European bioequivalence study is of Sanofi interest. So it means that it needs to remain of let's say in the joint development contract, and that company B would cover the 2/3 of the cost. Not mentioning basically, regardless of the regulatory requirements, you want to know as soon as possible that the development center came up with a formulation which is bioequivalent, right? You don't want to put it off till 2025 if you can do it right away. So, but we have a leverage to say that based on the law, we really want to use European B study results. That was it. Also, what was acceptable from their side, if eventually we didn't need it for Colombia or Turkey, for them, the study results with Turkish reference samples would be of no use. You would not succeed in Europe with Turkish samples, of course. So at the end, the European B study remained in the joint development contract and everything went smoothly. So that were some of the examples. I could carry on with the others. Now it reminded me that, for instance, we didn't mention API, zone for stability data on API, which for Brazil were also if not mandatory, at least very much preferable. And we didn't do it at the time of signing the contract. So there are a lot of things which we could have incorporated in the contract more. But of course, the lessons learned from this case study is that, of course, try to make as detailed list of the future development activities which will be anticipated from the development center before the signature of the agreement. Try to involve your regulatory counterparts, especially if your territories are emerging countries. Go into depth to assess the requirements. I would recommend you to, let's say, focus on the batch metrics, on the CPP requirements and the requirements for local clinical studies, to be able to reflect those requirements in the contract or as a part of customization activities. But as I told you, more tricky part is this joint development, where basically you co-fund the activities with the third party. So this is crucial. What is another lesson learned? Of course, that you will never ever be able to capture all possible scenarios or all situations. So be prepared for that, and be prepared that you should do some reasonable compromises. Yeah, basically, once it will be done by you, next time, either in the same project or if you are leading more projects, it will be their side. It's normal, like in life. But don't be afraid to challenge the other party if what they propose is against your company's interest. This is definitely solid. You always need to make sure that they respect what is in the development contract and also what is in your interest. Yeah, so maintain healthy relationship, professional relationship with them, just like it is your internal partner, and be prepared for the compromises and to challenge. And the last point I have here is that, this is maybe for project managers more, is that try to do more than what is expected from you as per the common agreement. So try to liaise with your opposite number, try to set up some recurrent meetings, prepare RACI charts to make sure that everyone is aware who is doing what, even if you have this driver, co-driver, let's say, distinction. Prepare checklists for dossier preparation, for instance, because the development center, they will provide you with formulation development. But since you're going to transfer the product to your side, then the GMP stability data will be coming from you. So it's also for you to have a clear picture who will provide what, and they need to know by when they need to provide it, because it's also for clinical studies. So if you have module 5, you end up with a clinical study, but you need to know when they will provide the literature references or clinical overview. They wouldn't do it if you don't ask them to do it, because they don't need it at the time. They will do it 5 years later on. So just make sure you have this checklist with the due dates, that everything is clear, into a micro level, and some project risk management plan, which you somehow co-develop with your project manager at the other side. It's also very helpful. So this is just my advice from this case study, what we learned here. And I don't know if we still have some time, but anyway.
Yeah, so let's quickly jump to questions. But first of all, thank you, Michal, for a very, very interesting presentation, because it is based on the real experiences. And so that makes it more valuable. So in the meanwhile, I have a couple of questions here in the chat box. First one from Bahadur Chakmak is about APIs. And so what are the most important criteria when you are selecting the API source? Are they flexibility, stability, cost, IP advantage, whatever? So what are the usual ones which you look at usually?
So frankly speaking, as I mentioned here, the development center was company B. So actually, who was responsible for the selection of the API supplier? It was basically company's B procurement team. It wasn't us. We basically wanted to make sure that the delivery at our side, the delivery from the CMO or from the API supplier will be stable enough. It will basically work scientifically. Of course, we are looking at the API prices as well. But in our specific case, there were not many options actually on the market. So we came up, or company B came up with in-house development of the API process. And then when we are seeking out for another external suppliers, they were like 2 options on the market. So your choice was pretty much limited. But normally, just like for always, you would need to look at the price and also the stability, etc. Yeah.
So we have the next session is starting at 10, but we will still wait for a few minutes. Ritu Patel is our speaker. So Ritu, please bear with us for a few more minutes. and because there are some interesting questions. So, Baha, whatever you mentioned in your comment are absolutely fine, but I think one of the other topics which I can add, which Michal just mentioned, usually we are also looking for a very good reputation from the API supplier with respect to remaining with us when the actual commercial production starts, because the development period is 2 to 4 years. And in that duration, they might change their DMF, or they might simply outrightly refuse to supply because of XYZ reason. And that is one of the major topics also generic companies face. So that's just one quick additional comment. And I know Michal would have also said the same. So the next question is also from Baha. Thank you, Baha. You are very active early in the morning. Thank you. And regarding the BE studies, sometimes FDA's recommendations are different than EMA and others. Do you define different clinical strategies to different scopes? Partly you covered this in your when you were explaining against different RLDs and etc. But what are your thoughts on that?
I think it was even addressed by Stephanie yesterday, of course, the different guidelines. So, in our specific case, we don't go with the generic business to US. So, I mean, with a few exceptions only, for example, in this case study, we also didn't go to US, but we had to, of course, respect the local guidelines. So, of course, if there is a must, unless it is a really mandatory must, we do not go with a separate B study. No one would do it voluntarily because you have extra development costs. But we have our regulatory teams working in touch with the regions who are assessing it on regular basis. So if we need in Brazil a local B study, we go for it. If we don't know it, if we don't need it in Colombia, we will not do it, of course. So it's maybe for bioequivalence study, it is, I would say, easier. For clinical phase 3 trials, it's a different discussion as well, which subjects you need to enroll into global phase 3. You need to respect that as well. So for FDA specifically, I have nothing to comment. We have a project for Canada and US. I know that we need to conduct separate studies for those two countries because they don't accept, again, the reference product from different country. So you need to listen to the law, of course. So
yeah, so in summary, what you're saying is two major factors. One is RLD, and the second is requirement to conduct local bioequivalence studies because some countries have that specific requirement. So based on those two, we overall define what is most efficient for the company, right?
Yes, exactly. And it goes hand in hand, actually. Yeah, even like if you look at it scientifically, typically there is no legitimate reason to conduct a study on local healthy volunteers, especially if it's Caucasian population. But it's somehow a way how the local, let's say, authorities want to engage their own industry, to participate. So you can question it, but at the end of the day, you will not launch if you don't do it. So typically, if the business case is favorable, you do it.
Absolutely. If I may add just very quickly, because I noticed in some oncology products, some of the countries have very specific requirement to conduct, I'm talking Asia, to conduct local bioequivalence studies, but then they don't have infrastructure locally to conduct bioequivalence studies for oncology orals. So they gave a waiver, okay, for this one, we will even accept from outside. So anyway, that's an interesting topic. Maybe we a suggestion to Vice Summit to arrange a separate session on this, perhaps a full day conference. So Stephanie Aman Mal has also a very interesting question. Practically, how often did you connect to the project manager or team of the partner, or project manager or team of the partner? How did you do the co-management of the project? I mean, regarding cooperation and frequency of contact.
Sure. This is also, we don't have too much time to describe it in detail, but just at the high level. So, what was interesting in this case is that, the company B was the driver of the project, as I said, based on the commercial assumption. So they should have taken the lead in many activities, but it's actually most of the things which we escalated were in interest of us in Sanofi. So it was at the end more myself being, let's say, the leader of having the calls and getting connected, etc., rather than the driver the driver project manager. Sorry. So how did we get in touch? We had the bi-weekly basis recurrent calls with the development project manager, with the global project manager at the company B side, and also with some support functions. And it was pretty much sufficient. We actually were able to have some informal calls if needed. It was a very transparent and smooth cooperation between the project managers, at least. So this is why I said maintain healthy relationship on bi-weekly basis. If there was no issue, or before the steering committee, we also get in touch. It was pretty much sufficient.
Okay, great. So I should say spasiba, thank you, and merci beaucoup to you, based on the major languages you speak, Michal. And it was a pleasure listening to your very insightful presentation. So for everyone, we will now go backstage, and we'll come back in a few seconds. So please hold on. So Michal, you can disconnect now.